Alex, congratulations on this podcast, because you are entering an area that we need to know more about in the way that it's always been there. But I really honestly think that as movie lovers, we've never respected this space until you're coming out here with more than a movie.
Well, thanks so much, Era. I appreciate that. I think you're referring to, just the fact that there really hasn't ever been a show about the kind of Latino impact on movies, on cinema. And some of that is because, we have not had the kind of representation that other groups have had, unfortunately. Even today, we're like about 20% of the population. We're only 4% of on-screen roles. And that number doesn't change much from year to year, let me tell you. And so for me, growing up, whenever there was a quote unquote either Latino movie or just a Latino person in a big movie, it was a big deal, and so, this season, especially, I decided to sort of dedicate it to the movies that I felt had really kind of broken through, or the moments that have broken through. For example, I grew up the first time, one of my earliest memories of going to the movies, probably too young, was my parents taking me to go see Godfather 3 in theaters. Oh, my God. and I was 8 years old, and I remember seeing Andy Garcia on the big screen playing an Italian guy. Yes, Godfather was one of those movies that played on repeat in my house, and I could not believe that this Cuban guy who had grown up in Miami Beach, just like my mom, was becoming the Godfather. And I decided in that moment I was either going to become the head of an organized crime family or go into Hollywood. And I chose the dirtier path, and I went into Hollywood. Yeah. And I got the chance to interview Andy Garcia about that, which was like a full circle dream come true moment. And to hear him tell the story, not from the point of view of, movie star Andy Garcia, but like as, Cuban American kid from Miami, trying to make it, get out to Hollywood, doesn't really know anybody, loading trucks and doing odd jobs. That point of view is what really interested me, because I think that's what's going to speak to the audience. Those are the kinds of details you don't get in these, quick hit interviews that you see when they're promoting movies, and those are the kinds of stories you really get down to him, him playing paddle tennis with his buddy Stephen Bauer, who played Manolo in Scarface, and showing up to the courts, and who are they playing against but none other than Al Pacino. And Andy's been in LA for like 6 months, and Godfather 3 is like 10 years away, and here's Stephen Bauer putting him next to Al Pacino and going, "Hey Al, doesn't he look like you?" And he's like, "Oh yeah, it kind of looks like me." Like those kinds of bites, those kinds of little anecdotes are what I live for. So yeah, that's what this season's all about,
Yeah. See, and I've always thought that Hollywood doesn't play fair, because you're right about Andy Garcia in The Godfather, because for the longest time, I always thought he was Italian. And then when you go to Scarface, it's like, wait a second, Al Pacino playing the part of a Cuban? What happened here? And they really do put us in places where it's like, I believe that this nation can't spell words because of all these companies that don't put the name, the true spelling of the business up on the building. They come up with something creative.
Completely. And listen, there's definitely instances of people who are not of one culture playing another culture. Another great guy that I talked to, who I think has done a phenomenal job playing Latino characters for most of his career, is Lou Diamond Phillips. Yes. Lou Diamond Phillips is half Filipino, part Native American, part a bunch of other stuff. I mean, he's really, that's as American as you come when you're just a mix of a bunch of other stuff, And Lou played Richie Valens. Yes. The iconic Latino Chicano rock and roll icon. But he was just a kid from Texas, and at the time they had gone through every. I talked to the filmmakers. I talked to Taylor Hackford. I talked to Luis Valdez. And, they describe going through this extensive casting process of trying to find a Latino kid. Luis Valdez, the guy who wrote and directed that movie, he was about as militant as they come. He had, come up in the grape fields with Cesar Chavez protesting, so he was really committed to authenticity. And they were reading Lou for the old part of the older brother, and they read all these people for Richie Valens, and then the studio, had their opinions, and the studio had put up this one choice that they weren't totally sold on, and I'll explain why. And finally, they bring Lou Diamond Phillips out to L.A. to read for Bob, the older brother, and Lou describes, reading with every actor, almost like he was part of the casting department. They just kept rolling him in, playing all these characters, and he kept reading Richie, and he wasn't really sure why, and he was sure he wasn't getting the Richie role because on the board was the casting choice that the studio wanted, and it said Richie Valens, and underneath there was a headshot, and the headshot said John Stamos.
Whoa.
And so, almost, we were this close to having Uncle Jesse playing Richie Valens. And Lou really pulled it out. And by the end of that trip, they said to him, hey, Lou, we want you to play Richie, and that changed the trajectory of his entire life. So, yeah, man, it can happen. It can happen that, people who aren't Latino play Latino roles, but most of the time it's what you're saying. Most of the time it's Scarface. Yep. All respect to Mr. Pacino, legend, one of my favorite actors, but it would not be unfair to call that brown face, especially given that he literally made his face more brown with makeup, so it was let's just say it was refreshing to see Andy play, Vincent Mancini,
So many times, even when Asians appeared on old television, they were typecast. And Lou Diamond Phillips, to me, was typecast in La Bamba because, every time I see him now, I always think of La Bamba. And that's not fair to him, the actor. It really isn't, because he needs to have a role where he can really express his real talents.
Absolutely, and he's done some roles. He did a film recently where he's that I believe he was a producer on, where he played a Filipino actor, and he describes having some challenges now because so many people think he's Latino. He's played so many Latino characters, but now they won't even call him in for Latino roles anymore, which is a really interesting kind of reversal. And I think it's these are the let's just call them side effects of progress. Is you want nothing about us without us is the kind of positive is the popular phrase now. And you want Latinos playing Latinos, but me personally, I look at Lou Diamond and I'm like, Filipinos are the Latinos of Asia. We both, Cubans and Filipinos both make lechon. You know what I mean? So we both love a roast pig, and so for me, I look at him and I say, Lou should be able to play whatever he wants. He has a great role in Stand and Deliver too, where he plays a Mexican kid from East LA, So I think there are cases. I think there are cases where exceptions can be made, but for the most part, we're looking at more than a movie at these kind of pivotal moments where you see big breakouts. I talked to Patricia Cardozo, the director of Real Women Have Curves, which was a Sundance indie darling that broke the career of America Ferrera, who of now Barbie fame, and what it was like casting a 17-year-old America in this role to lead her first big film, Wow. We talked to the creators of Spy Kids, and to Alexa Pena Vega, who is really like the first Latina, kind of superhero on screen, in that role. So, we're really looking at not only what these firsts were, but why, because again, I go back to this sad statistic of 4% of these on-screen roles. And what can we do? What can we learn from the past to break through? But more than anything else, I have to say, the podcast is really about putting you, the listener, in the shoes
Yep.
of these people
Yep.
in Hollywood at the time that they were making it. You know, like what is it like to just be a regular kid from some small town, you know, and get your big break? You know, what is it like to have a music icon like Richie Valens, you know, and like Taylor Hackford, an Oscar winner, director of Ray, you know, and Blood and Blood Out. He talks about like loving Richie Valens and going up to Richie Valens' family's house and
Wow.
talking that family into trusting him with the rights to that movie. You know, like those are the moments that I really wanted to put the listeners in this season.
Yeah, in this age of Netflix and Hulu, and we can download or even stream any movie we want, but we still don't understand who people like Natalie Morales is. I mean, and that to me is where that's what we're missing about the movie experience. Get to know who these actors and actresses are.
Absolutely. And Natalie's an exceptional case. I mean, you know, that is a name you're going to hear more about. And I'll tell you, it's in no small part due to the fact that she had a dual directorial debut. Natalie Morales decided she wanted to direct movies in addition to be an actress that you've seen on Parks and Rec and a number of other shows. And she directed 2 movies in 1 year. Jeez. An amazing small movie with Mark Duplass called Language Lessons. That's simply about a guy whose husband buys him a set of Spanish lessons during the pandemic. And he gets on Zoom and he develops this friendship with the Spanish teacher. And I don't want to give away the twist because it's a big one, but they end up, you know, not in a romantic way. They end up sort of depending on each other through the pandemic. And it's a really interesting way to shoot a movie. It's shot almost wholly on Zoom. And these two are so charming in it. You're glued to the screen. And then within months, she directed a movie called Plan B.
That's it.
That's about these 2 girls just looking for the Plan B pill, you know, in their small town in the Midwest and having, you know, some trouble finding it and having to go on a road trip to go get it. And, you know, I've never heard of a person directing 2 movies in 1 year like that, even big directors, you know, and Natalie's such an exceptional talent that she really pulled it off. And I really loved both of those movies. And so it was such a cool experience talking to her about how she balanced those things in addition to her acting career, you know. So, yeah, that is a name you're going to hear more about. So, yeah, we have the range here. You know, we have legends like Andy and Lou, and then, you know, we have the folks that are going to be the next generation.
You know what's really interesting, Alex, about what you're doing, and I respect you 100% for what you're doing, in sitting down to have real conversations with every one of these people, because in this moment of now, sure, it's a podcast, but I'm always focused on 25 to 50 years from now when you took the time to sit down and have a conversation with people who are no longer with us. And I hope you are protecting these interviews in ways that your focus is also on the long-term future.
Well, Arrow, I really appreciate that. And that, you know, one of the people that I was really excited to talk to with that in mind was Luis Valdez, who I mentioned earlier. Luis is a guy, he directed La Bamba.
Yep.
He directed the film version of a play that he wrote called Zoot Suit.
Yes.
And Zoot Suit is the movie that made Edward James Olmos a star. It is also, in all of my interviews, going back to season 1, I can't tell you, I would venture to say it's not an exaggeration that 50% of the people actors that I have interviewed for season 1 and season 2 were inspired to become actors or believe that they could make it because they either saw a production of Zoot Suit, saw the movie Zoot Suit, or were in Zoot Suit. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so, and this guy has such an unusual trajectory to Hollywood. He really started his career doing plays in the middle of the fields with Cesar Chavez during the sort of migrant, you know, organizing era, you know, out here in California, you know, the grape strikes and all that stuff. This is where this guy cut his teeth, doing plays on the back of ox carts for these people and getting them involved in the theater making. And so, you know, I wanted to preserve that history of Teatro Campesino, which is this legendary Chicano, mostly Chicano, but Latino theater company that includes people like Tony Plana, you know, who you've seen in a number of movies. Yeah. And so Luis started there. So, yeah, this is also a kind of, you know, I hope, important historical record for that reason. And to give people like Luis their due, because we don't have folks like Edward James Olmos without Luis.
Yep. Let's stay in the future just for 1 second, only because there's something that's happening in a major league way in this nation. We all know that it's changing, but for the first time in history, Latin-based music outperformed other styles and genres of music in 2023. I believe it's coming to movies as well. I believe that we're going to see more of this, and it's not going to be like I said earlier, stereotypical.
I mean, look, from your mouth to God's ears, right? But I'm a little more skeptical.
Really?
Yeah. Not because, this is the funny thing, man. In my day job, we'll say, when I'm not getting to host a podcast more than a movie, I make documentaries, and before that, I was a TV executive at HBO and other places. And, I have the good fortune that my parents, who literally came to this country penniless, created a very stable kind of middle-class background for me, and that allowed me to pursue what is admittedly a kind of bougie thing to do. When you tell your parents you want to be an actor initially, or even a producer, and they're penniless immigrants, they look at you a little askance, they're like, hey, wouldn't you rather be an engineer or a lawyer, and so, there's a lot of the socioeconomics are not in our favor. Latinos, except for Native Americans, Latinos are the lowest earners of any group in America. And I think that plays an inordinate role in why we don't have more Latinos in Hollywood in general, right? And I think when you have bigger and bigger numbers, that's not to say there are plenty of Latinos who are not getting their shot in Hollywood, simply because I think people like to tell stories that are familiar to them. Right. And so when you're an Anglo guy who grew up in the Midwest, and an Anglo guy who grew up in the Midwest comes to pitch you a story about an Anglo kid that grew up in the Midwest, that's the kind of story you want to tell. Yep. It's not racism. It's just kind of an implicit bias towards the things that are familiar, So that does happen for sure. But the other factor involved here is money. And until Hollywood figures out how to not make it so that you have to have an unpaid internship for 3 years to get a job, or until you're not an actor who has to cobble together 3 minimum wage jobs to make a living, until you find a way to create a pipeline to let working class kids find their way into Hollywood, I think this Latino problem is going to persist, to be honest. I hope not, but I think it is.
God, I love your heart. I love your stance. I love everything about you, dude. And you've got to come back to this show in the future, because we barely scratched the surface today, man.
Thank you, Arrow. I've loved coming on this show, and I really appreciate you giving More Than a Movie a platform, man. It means a lot.
Well, you be brilliant today, okay, Alex?
Thanks, Arrow. You too.